It's 7 o'clock in the Eastern time zone in North America and 6 o'clock in the Central time zone where most of us are located. And we appreciate you joining Confirming the Church's Bible class this week. Thank you very much. We're here every week at this hour. We stream for 30 minutes live. Our purpose is to study the Bible to learn what is the Lord's plan for the church which He established. We've been studying the book of Acts. We have come to chapter 16. We have Paul and Silas on the second missionary journey. Timothy and Luke traveled with him when he came into Philippi. That's where we have been discussing. So we'll pick up here at verse 19 in just a little bit. Let's introduce ourselves around the country here, well up and down the Central time zone. We're missing one tonight from another time zone, but maybe in a couple hours when the time gets around, he'll catch up with us. I don't know. But anyway, speaking from near Chicago, I'm A.L.Parr. Contact information on the poster behind me. You can contact any one of us through this means. My telephone number, email address, website is all there. We'd be glad to hear from you. Of course, you can leave your comments on the YouTube or the Google Plus or wherever you happen to be watching tonight. You can leave your comments right there, and we'll pick up those at the first opportunity. Whenever we see them, we'll be glad to answer whatever comments you might wish to make. And joining with us from, about halfway down across the country, Tony Brewer in Arkansas. Good evening, Tony.
Good evening, Al. Good evening, Bruce. It's such a pleasure to be here this evening. It is evening in Arkansas. It's 6 o'clock, but it's still light outside. We just had the daylight savings time, the time change. Listen, if we're in Bay, Arkansas, if you're ever getting around to northeast Arkansas, look us up. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm happy to study God's Word. Now, I'm going to pass this back to you.
You're going to have to stay in one place for a while so you remember where you are. You've been up just about the whole east coast of Arkansas from south to north with a stop in the middle. But we're glad you're with us here. You can always meet people online, regardless of where we are in the world. We've got folks right now joining us about 5:30 in the morning in at least 2 locations in India that I know about. And we're so very thankful, brethren, that you have joined us and encouraged others to sit in front of the computer at that hour of darkness along with you to study the Bible. We appreciate you, and we appreciate your comments as well. And for the rest of you, wherever you are in the country, we know that we have many people who join us, some live and many after the fact, watching the recordings that are online. Well, Tony mentioned Bruce. Bruce is joining us from near Houston. Bruce, good evening to you, and thanks for joining.
Good evening, Al and Tony. It's good to be on the program tonight, and we have a wonderful passage to study. There are some very practical things that will help all of us to be strong and to be what the Lord would have us to be.
Well, that's very good, and that's very true what I mean to say, and we appreciate you saying so, Bruce. In fact, let me just give us a little background and start. I'll read the text, and Bruce, you just go ahead and make what comments come to your mind at this point of the text. As I mentioned, we're in Acts chapter 16. We are looking at Paul and Silas in Philippi. Timothy was traveling with them. Luke joined them in Troas as they came across into Macedonia. And we have noticed in the past, last week we noticed the young girl that had the spirit of divination and was professing Paul's doctrine, and Paul turned around and condemned her. Well, there were some unscrupulous business people that were taking advantage of her gift, just like somebody who maybe could predict the lottery and or the numbers coming up in Vegas or somewhere like that. And so they were taking advantage of her. And when she lost that gift, when Paul chased that demon out of her, they got angry. Here's what it says in verse number 19. When her masters saw that the hope of their gains was gone, they caught Paul and Silas and drew them into the marketplace unto the rulers. Let me just go ahead and read verse 20. We'll take this one at a time maybe. And they brought them to the magistrates, saying, these men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city. All right, Bruce, what do you have on that, on those 2 verses?
Something that immediately comes to mind is how that sometimes when we preach the truth, when we stand for the truth, there will be those who will not appreciate it. As we see here, we might even go so far as to say viciously opposed to it. one thing that's encouraging to me is to notice the courage and the dedication of Paul and Silas. I'm afraid that increasingly we see in our world the attitude among members of the church, if something that opposes the gospel comes along, let's just leave them alone. Let's just hope that they'll get things turned around. But there are bigger fish to fry. There are more important things to be concerned about. But here was an occasion when Paul and Silas didn't let down, even though it meant, as we'll see in the verses to come, a very torturous, if you please, situation.
Thank you. We talked last week about why Paul would cast out the demon that was basically telling people that he was teaching the truth. You can go back and pick up that discussion on YouTube in the archive version. You just pick up from last week's date, which had been March the, well, I've lost my place here. I still got February's calendar on the wall. What was last week? 7th, March the 7th. Go look at that program and you can see that particular argument. So why would he do that? But they were bold, as you said, and they were courageous, and they were preaching the truth, and there were good reasons to cast that demon out, though they might suspect that it would cause problems with the people who were manipulating her, and now they're being forcibly dragged against their will into before the tribunals, the courts that can punish them. Tony, what do you see in that particular event?
I find it very interesting that knowing what we know about this woman or young girl having the spirit of divination, I believe that the reason her masters was able to get gain is because she divined rightly. I mean, after all, she was telling the truth here. And I think it's very interesting how they put the God of money up above the God of the universe. You know, when her master saw that the hope of their gains was gone, that's when they caught Paul and Silas and threw them into the marketplace, into the rulers. They didn't care that this woman was telling the truth about Jesus Christ and about Paul and Silas. They didn't care what was right. They cared about what was profitable in this world, and we should expect no less from the world today.
We have seen Paul and Silas and Barnabas encountering people who oppose their doctrine and stoned Paul, left him for dead. We've seen all kinds of difficult treatment because they disagreed with doctrine. That's a very astute observation. In this case, Paul had been preaching for days a doctrine that might reasonably be assumed to cut into their prophets or at least to find fault with their practices. And they essentially left him alone until, and I appreciate the way you pointed out here, because I've got that in my notes as well. When they saw that the hope of their gains was gone, didn't even say they lost any money yet. They saw that the hope of their gains was gone. And, you know, that raises a question in my mind. What's the basis of your hope? Their hope was for money, ill-gotten gains. And they reacted physically, even one might say violently, when they lost the expectation of continuing in those ill-gotten gains. That's a good point. Also, notice that Paul and Silas were picked up and taken. Why Paul and Silas? Where were Timothy and Luke? Well, you know what? The scripture doesn't tell us. We know they came to town with Paul, and they were together when they saw Lydia and taught her. Luke says we were there. But where they are at this point, Luke says that happened to them. We don't know where Luke and Timothy were, and so anything would just be speculation. And those are worthless. We don't need to build any faith on. But here's what I see in this thing, and here's where I see an application for many situations we run into today. We run into people sometimes who get very loud and boisterous and sometimes physical and animated over our doctrine and over our practice when we're just trying to teach the peace and love of Christ. and live in this world as a child of God. These people were acting irrationally. Hope of money was gone. And they went out and they grabbed these two preachers. Why just these two? Maybe it's the first people they saw. I don't know. But it was an irrational action on their part. And there's no rational explanation for the actions of irrational people. And that's a lesson that we need to learn and remember. Sometimes people are going to oppose us and persecute us even. And we try to say, well, why are you doing this? Sometimes that's just a worthless question to ask. There is no why that can be given. They just don't like the truth. I had a man tell me one time, that's enough. We don't want to hear anymore. Yeah, I know. Yeah, that happens very often in life. So, sometimes what the Bible doesn't say creates some questions amongst us, and that's normal. We're human beings. But when those questions become debates and arguments, and we start building faith on our opinions about those questions that cannot be answered, we don't have a faith in Jesus Christ anymore. Our faith is on ourselves. And we need to be very, very careful of that. So we've seen in these two verses the boldness, the conviction of the preachers, and we have seen the irrational actions of ungodly men opposing them. And we're going to see as we go on what happened to both, at least to the preachers. Any comments or questions before we continue?
I'd like to say one thing. There's a contrast here. These this girl's masters were trying to lay up treasures on earth, and of course, Paul and Silas and every Christian in the world today should be trying to lay up treasures in heaven. We're not supposed to care about earthly gain. Of course, I'm referencing Matthew chapter 6, 19 and 20.
Yep, that's right. Yep, they had the wrong motive to start with, but that's what their hope was in. So, all right, very good. Anything else? If not, let's see. We looked in. Did you have something, Bruce?
Yes. Something that occurred to me in verse 20, Paul and Silas, the text does not say that they were troubling the city, but it was the magistrate said, these men being Jews exceedingly troubled. It was just their word. It was an accusation they were making. I think that's significant.
I know that the three of us are clearly familiar with the situation, but back in the days of old wicked King Ahab in the north, God came in the person of Elijah and told Ahab, just how it was going to be, and you need to stop your sin and your crime and rule these people righteously. God said there's not going to be any rain. Or Elijah said, there won't be any rain in this country until I say so. Well, that was coming from God. He was speaking what God gave him to speak. And so no rain, no crops growing, no food to eat. There's a famine in the land. And after about 3.5 years, Elijah has had enough of this, and he's looking all over Ahab is looking all over the country for Elijah, and God is hiding Elijah. And at one point, God says, okay, now it's time to go back and face him, and let's have it out. And so Elijah sends a message to Ahab, meet me over here, I'll be there. And so when Ahab comes, you know what he said? Are you that troubler of Israel? And Elijah's answer was, hey, I'm not the troubler of Israel. You are the troubler of Israel. The man preaching the truth against sin is not the one making trouble. The one in the sin and preaching the sin has already caused a whole lot of trouble. On one occasion, Paul and his companions were accused of having turned the world upside down, when in point of fact has been oftentimes observed they were turning the world right side up. It was already upside down from all the sin and corruption that had been brought in by the false teachers, by the godless teachers. What do we mean by that? God created this world, and that's what, God-hating people don't want to admit. God created this world. He told us how we're supposed to live here, what our responsibility is, what are the guidelines by which we live. And people were doing something else. They were turning it upside down. And the preachers of righteousness, preachers of truth come along and say, no, 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 here's the way it's supposed to be. Friends, that's what we're trying to do on this program. We live in a world in which religion has been corrupted by thousands of various so-called denominations, but the Lord's church is not denominated. They're not denominations, they are sects, a breakaway portion that thinks it's the best, at least the best for me, if not the best for you. I'll do it my way. That's a sect. And Paul said as much when he was on trial at a later time beyond where we're studying in chapter 16. Even a heresy, the Bible uses that term. And what we're doing on this program is to try to call the people back to the plan that the Lord gave. Jesus said, I will build my church, and he did, and he added people to it, as is clearly stated in Acts chapter 2 in the last verse of that chapter. And he hadn't changed the plan. Everything else in the New Testament following that verse is piece by piece, plank by plank, the platform upon which people are supposed to stand if they expect to be pleasing to God. That's what Paul and Silas were preaching when they went from church to church, as we've seen in an earlier place, at the end of chapter 15, beginning of chapter 16. And now they're in a place where there is no church, and they're preaching to start the church. And they're planting that church on the very same terms by which they were strengthening the churches already existing. Well, I guess that's the soliloquy today. But let's, if nothing else on 19 and 20, and I think we pretty much said about all of it. Tony, why don't you go ahead and read for us verse number 21. Let's stop with that verse.
All right, Acts 16:21. And teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being Romans.
Yeah, I could have added that, I suppose, to our previous verses. It's a continuation of the sentence. They're teaching, verse 19, verse 20 rather, these men being Jews do exceedingly trouble the city and teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive. Why? Because we're Jews. Tony, explain that to us.
Well, again, I see a contrast here between verse 20 and 21 and what the magistrates are saying. These men are Jews. Well, they do exceedingly trouble our city, and they teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being Romans. So they pit their status as a Roman citizen against the laws and such that Paul and Silas are teaching. Again, they are trying to follow I wouldn't say doctrine, they're just trying to put civil law above the law of God. And, they make a good case, and this is not the first time such cases are made. We can see this throughout the New Testament. But anyway, that's the main thing that I see, that these masters are leveling this accusation and say that you've got the Jews are teaching customs that they aren't allowed to, and that we're not allowed to receive because we're Romans. Now get them. They're going against the civil law. And
so far as the record is concerned, now we have to understand that likely there were more words spoken than are recorded here. That's the way natural conversation would flow. But according to the record, there's not a single piece of evidence that is presented here. They're trying to prejudice the court on national issues, on maybe even racial type issues, citizenship issues. Hey, we're Romans, We're going to do different from that. We're not going to tolerate that here. And the Romans thought they were bigger and better than everybody else. And you've had races or nationalities in the world before and after that had the same attitude about themselves. But they're not giving evidence. They're trying to stir up the crowd and the emotions of the court. Or if not the emotions of the court, at least perhaps, and we don't know what their purpose might have been, but it would be natural with human nature to try to stir up the crowd so that the court would take notice and rule for peace. Let's just go with the crowd. So, Pilate did that. kings and senators do that even today. Let's give the people what they want so that we don't have a riot on our hands. It's sometimes called ruling from behind or leading from behind. Sometimes the leaders bow down to what the people want, even though it's completely wrong. But that's exactly what was doing here, as we see in verse number 22. And I'll go ahead and read this, and we got comments on 21 and 20. We can back up to that, but put all this together. And the multitude rose up together against them, that is, against Paul and Silas. And the magistrates rent off their clothes, that is, the clothes of Paul and Silas, and commanded to beat them. So here they were coming in before the magistrates and prejudicing the court, and it worked. They were just throwing out this national difference issue, a racial issue, if you will, and it got things stirred up. The enemy of the truth, and that's what all this is about. Paul and Silas out there preaching the truth. We want to show you the best possible life you can ever have on this earth. Follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Oh, we don't want that. We want things our way. And so, they went ballistic on them, as the expression is, and they got a riot in the streets, as it were. And now Paul and Silas are about to be beaten and thrown into jail. Well, let me pause here. What other thoughts do you see? Observations here. Go ahead.
I thought about something from this, making application. I'm sure all three of us have seen situations where a member of a sect, member of a denomination, studies the Bible with a member of the Lord's church, and they get pretty close to, they're beginning to see that taking the Bible as it is, pure and simple, it's making sense to them. But there's an element of doubt, and they'll go back to their preacher, and the preacher is, first of all, looking out for himself because it won't look good for him losing members, and he will prejudice this person against the truth. You know how those members of the Church of Christ, how legalistic, they don't believe in grace and things like that. And he's already thinking ahead. If this person is influenced to obey the gospel, that the word that the Church of Christ teaches, there may be 5 or 10 or 15 others. So the preacher may just lash out and say things very heated, very mean-spirited.
Yeah, watch the spirit of Paul and Silas throughout this whole thing. We're going to see a couple of points that we can comment on the way, but you won't see any of that. You won't see any, lashing back or getting into an argument or a fuss or any kind of fighting at all. That's not the way we handle opposition to the lifestyle that we're trying to live. We're walking in the footsteps of the Prince of Peace. And we don't turn around and slug somebody in the face because he doesn't like it. That's not much peace there. We got enough of that in the world. People call themselves the religion of peace, and they kill all their enemies. If you don't agree that we're religion of peace, we'll show you. We'll just kill you. That's not the way Christians do. If you're going to preach peace, you're going to practice peace. And we're going to see that in Paul and Silas. Anything else then before we go on? We got time for another verse or two tonight. Bruce, go ahead with verse 22 then, if you would. You're muted, Bruce. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Then the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates tore off their clothes and commanded them to be beaten with rods.
Go ahead on through verse 24.
And when they had laid many stripes on them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. Having received such a charge, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks.
Well, most people who are familiar at all with the Apostle Paul, and certainly with his second missionary journey, are familiar with this event. Paul and Silas in the Philippian jail. But there are a couple of things here before we start getting into lessons to be drawn from it. I want to look at some words that are in this passage. Scripture says they rent their clothes off. That is, they tore. They didn't take them off. They tore their clothes off of them. They beat them publicly and without a trial, which was illegal under the Roman law. That's the kind of treatment that these preachers were being given. And they laid many stripes upon them. Well, if it were a Jewish community, the law said 40 and no more. These aren't Jews. These are Romans, and they don't have any such rules of mercy. They're going to beat you, as it were, unmercifully with many stripes. I don't know how many. They had no limitation on what they could do, legally or emotionally. And then they cast them into the prison. You know, the Greek word here is they just threw them in, like you'd throw a ball. There's no kind treatment at all, no respect for them as human beings. And then the jailer was charged to keep them. There was such an unusual concern for the security of these people that the jailer was commanded to keep them securely, and he thrust them into the inner prison. And maybe we can talk about that in a little bit. But the words that are used here are words that describe vicious, uncaring, unmerciful treatment against these people. Your thoughts?
Al, I've got a thought here with the way they were treated. You know, growing up in a very rural area, let's say a rabid dog. If a rabid dog were to come upon your property, you might have to take action that shall remain unspoken on this venue. But you would not so treat that rabid dog in such a manner of disrespect as these two men were treated.
Yeah, you've heard the expression, I wouldn't treat a dog, the way they treated me. And that may be true in many communities. But yeah, they were brutally manhandled, as we might say. So how do you respond to something like that? Well, in these verses we've read, there's no indication how Paul and Silas responded to it, but we'll see that in the next couple of verses. We're going to have to do that on our next class. And again, we're here every week at this time, 6 o'clock in the Central Time Zone, 7 o'clock in the East. You can look that up wherever you are. I think that's 2100 if you're following the universal clock. Greenwich Mean Time, as we used to call it. In some places it still do. But wherever that is around the world, you can catch us live if you've got an internet with a connection that will allow you to do so. And if not, then all of these lessons are recorded and preserved on YouTube and accessible there. And again, you can find us through this particular website. Please give us a call, contact us, let us know what your comments or questions are, pro or con, on this class or on this entire series of lessons. We definitely want to hear from you. We had a caller, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that had some questions about, a viewer had some questions about some of the things we were talking, said, I want to study this. And we gave him some thoughts, some scripture references to look up so we could get together and study. We haven't been able to get back together again, but we'll try that very soon and get back with him. We want to study the Bible with you if you want to know who God is, and certainly if you want to please him and get into heaven. So, Tony, any concluding thoughts tonight?
No, sir. You've summed it up very well. We need to stand firm for the faith. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here.
I'm glad you're here. Tony's suffered under a little bit of weather-related issues or something there, and picked up a little bit of a bug, and he held out well. He'll probably go to bed when this is all over with. Get you a cup of hot tea with honey in it or something, Tony. Bruce, any final thoughts from you? You just muted yourself.
Okay, sorry. One concluding thought, as we do the Lord's work, the Lord will be with us. And that is, I think, at the foundation of the reason that Paul and Silas could continue following in the Lord's step, because they knew that the Lord was with them, that he would never abandon or forsake them.
I have a heavy correspondence load in Bible teaching and encouraging teachers and preachers around the world. And in nearly every letter, I conclude by saying, God will bless you as you study his word. And that's true. That's a promise from him. That's not just preacher talk. So open the Bible and study it. As I mentioned earlier in a correspondence today, we schedule this class for this time because it's a supper hour for many of us here in the United States and Canada, and gives the family a time together, maybe around the table, to sit and discuss some spiritual topics that will be meaningful to us. We hope the class has been meaningful to you. And again, if you have comments and ways that we might answer questions for you or be more helpful to you, please let us know. We look forward to seeing you again next time, and good night for now, and may God richly bless you.